Here we have arrived at one of the most terrible phases of my military career. Marshal Lannes had just won a great victory, and, the next day, after receiving the reports of all the generals, he dictated the battle bulletin that was to be carried to the emperor by one of his officers. Now, since Napoleon usually granted a rank to the officer who came to announce an important success to him, the marshals, for their part, entrusted these missions to the man they wished to promote promptly. It was a kind of recommendation to which Napoleon never failed to accede. Marshal Lannes having done me the honor of designating me to inform the emperor of the victory of Tudela, I could indulge the hope of soon becoming a squadron leader. But, alas, my blood still had to flow many times before I obtained that rank. The main road from Bayonne to Madrid by way of Vitoria, Miranda del Ebro, Burgos, and Aranda forks at Miranda, with the one that leads to Saragossa by way of Logroño and Tudela. A road from Tudela to Aranda, across the mountains of Soria, connects them and forms an immense triangle. The emperor had advanced from Burgos to Aranda during the time it had taken Marshal Lannes to go to Tudela and fight there. It was, therefore, much shorter, in order to join him, to go directly from Tudela to Aranda than to return by way of Miranda del Ebro. But the latter route had the immense advantage of being covered by the French armies, whereas the other was sure to be filled with Spanish fugitives who, having escaped the route of Tudela, might have taken refuge in the mountains of Soria. However, since the emperor had informed Marshal Lannes that he was directing Marshal Ney's corps from Aranda toward Tudela by way of Soria, Lannes, who believed Ney to be not far off, and had sent, on the day after the battle, an advance guard to Tarazona to establish contact with him, thought that this link-up would guarantee me against any attack as far as Aranda. He therefore ordered me to take the shortest route, that of Soria. I will frankly admit that if I had been given the choice, I would have preferred to make the great detour by way of Miranda and Burgos, but since the marshal's order was explicit, could I express fear for my person before a man who never feared anything for himself, and was the same for others? The marshal's aides-de-camp service was terrible in Spain. Formerly, during the wars of the Revolution, the generals had couriers, paid by the state, to carry their dispatches, but the emperor, finding that these men were incapable of giving any explanation of what they had seen, dismissed them, ordering that henceforth dispatches would be carried by aides-de-camp. That worked very well, so long as we made war among the good Germans, who never thought of attacking a Frenchman galloping along the post road. But the Spaniards waged a relentless war on them, which was very useful to the insurgents, for the contents of our dispatches informed them of the movements of our armies. I do not think I exaggerate in putting at more than 200 the number of staff officers who were killed or captured during the War of the Peninsula from 1808 to 1814. If the death of a mere courier was regrettable, it had to be less so than the loss of a promising officer, exposed besides to the risks of the battlefield, added to those of travelling by post. A great many robust men, well versed in their trade, asked to perform this service, but the emperor never consented. At the moment of my departure from Tudela, the good Commander Saint-Mars, having ventured a few remarks to dissuade Marshal Lannes from sending me through the mountains, the latter replied, Bah, he will meet Ney's advance guard tonight, whose troops are echeloned as far as the imperial headquarters at Aranda. I could oppose nothing to such a decision. I therefore left Tudela on November 24th, at nightfall, with a cavalry platoon, and arrived without incident as far as Tarazona, at the entrance to the mountains. In that small town, I found the advance guard of Marshal Lannes, whose commander, having no news of Marshal Ney, had pushed an infantry outpost 6 leagues forward toward Ágreda, where Ney was expected. But as that detachment was far from any support, it had received orders to fall back and return to Tarazona if the night passed without it seeing Marshal Ney's scouts. From Tarazona on, there are no more main roads. One marches constantly along mountainous paths covered with pebbles and shards of rock. The commander of our advance guard, therefore, had only infantry and some 20 hussars of the 2nd Regiment, Chamborant. He had a troop horse and 2 orderlies given to me, and I continued on by the light of a very bright moon. I had gone 2 or 3 leagues when we heard several gunshots, whose bullets whistled very near us. We did not see those who had fired. They were hidden in the rocks. A little farther on, we found the corpses of 2 French infantrymen, newly murdered. They had been entirely stripped, but since their shakos lay beside them, I was able to read the numbers engraved on the plates and recognize that these unfortunates belonged to one of the regiments of Marshal Ney's corps. Finally, at some distance from there, we saw, horrible to say, a young officer of the 10th Chasseurs à Cheval, still wearing his uniform, nailed by his hands and feet to a barn door. The poor man's head was hanging downward, and a small fire had been lit beneath him. Fortunately for him, his torments had ceased. He was dead. Yet, since the blood from his wounds was still flowing, it was evident that his torture was recent, and that the assassins were not far off. I therefore drew my saber, and my 2 hussars brought their carbines to the ready. It was well that we were on our guard, for a few moments later, 7 or 8 Spaniards, 2 of them mounted, fired on us from a thicket, behind which they were crouching. None of us being wounded, our 2 hussars returned fire with their carbines, and each killed an enemy. Then, drawing their sabers, they charged rapidly at the others. I would have liked to follow them, but the horse I was riding, having lost a shoe on the stones, was limping so badly that it was impossible to put him to the gallop. I raged all the more because I feared the hussars, carried away by the pursuit, would get themselves killed in some ambush. I called them for 5 minutes. At last I heard the voice of one of them, speaking in a strong Alsatian accent. "Ah, the brigands. You do not yet know the hussars of Chamboran. You will see they do not jest." My troopers had just brought down 2 more Spaniards, namely, a Capuchin monk mounted on the horse of the poor lieutenant of chasseurs, whose cartridge belt he had slung around his neck, and a peasant riding a mule, whose back also bore the clothing of the unfortunate infantryman I had found dead. It was evident that we had the assassins. An order from the emperor prescribed formally that any Spaniard, not a soldier, taken with arms in hand, be shot on the spot. What else was there to do with these 2 brigands, already grievously wounded, who had just killed 3 Frenchmen in such a barbarous manner? I therefore urged my horse forward so as not to witness the execution, and the hussars put the monk and the peasant to death, repeating, "Ah, you do not know the Chamborant." I could not understand how an officer of chasseurs and 2 infantrymen of Marshal Ney's corps found themselves so close to Tarazona when their regiments had not yet passed that way. But it is probable that those unfortunates, captured elsewhere, were being escorted toward Saragossa when the Spaniards who were leading them, having learned of their compatriots' defeat at Tudela, took their revenge by massacring the prisoners. I continued on my way, the beginning of which was hardly encouraging. At last, after a few hours' march, we saw, in the open field, a bivouac fire. It was that of the outpost detached by the French advance guard I had left at Tarazona. The second lieutenant commanding this detachment, having no news of Marshal Ney, was preparing to return toward Tarazona at daybreak, as he had been ordered. He knew we were no more than 2 short leagues from Ágreda, but did not know whether that town was occupied by troops of one nation or the other. I then found myself in great perplexity, for the infantry detachment was to withdraw in a few hours, and if I returned with it, when perhaps I had only 1 league to go to meet the head of Marshal Ney's columns, I would be showing little courage and exposing myself to Marshal Lannes's reproaches. On the other hand, if Marshal Ney's troops were still 1 or 2 days' march away, it was almost certain that I would be massacred by the peasants of those mountains, or by soldiers who had taken refuge there, all the more since I would be obliged to travel alone. Indeed, the 2 brave hussars who had been ordered to accompany me until we found the infantry platoon had to return to Tarazona. No matter, I decided to push on ahead. But, once that decision was taken, a great difficulty still remained to be overcome. It was to find a mount. In that solitude, there was neither farm nor village where I might procure a horse. The one I was riding was limping horribly. The hussars' horses were very tired. Besides, none of those men could have lent me his, without being severely punished by his chiefs, the regulations being explicit on that point. Finally, the horse of the officer of chasseurs, having received a bullet in the thigh during the skirmish, could be of no use to me. There remained only the peasant's mule. It was magnificent and belonged, by the laws of war, to the 2 hussars, who fully intended to sell it when they returned to the army corps. Nevertheless, those 2 good soldiers did not hesitate to lend it to me and placed my saddle on its back. But that accursed creature, more used to carrying a pack than being ridden, proved so unruly and obstinate that, as soon as I tried to make it leave the group of horses, it began to kick and refused ever to go forward alone. I was obliged to dismount, on pain of being hurled into some precipice. I therefore resolved to set out on foot. I had already taken leave of the infantry officer when that excellent young man, named Mr. Tassin, a former student of the military school of Fontainebleau, where he had been close to my unfortunate brother Felix, ran after me, saying that he was too sorry to see me expose myself thus alone, and that, although he had no orders to that effect, and though his improvised voltigeurs were all inexperienced conscripts and very little inured to war, he wanted to give me one of them, so that I would at least have a musket and a few cartridges in case of attack. I accepted, and it was agreed that I would send the infantryman back with Marshal Ney's corps. I set out, then, with the soldier who was to accompany me. He was a lower Norman, slow of speech, hiding much slyness under an apparent good nature. Normans are generally brave. I had proof of it when I commanded the 23rd Chasseurs, in which there were 500 to 600 of them. However, in order to know to what point I could count on the man who followed me, I talked with him as we went along, and asked whether he would stand firm if we were attacked. But he, saying neither yes nor no, replied, "Well now, we shall see." From which I concluded that my new companion might very well, at the moment of danger, go see what was happening in the rear. The moon had just set. Day had not yet dawned. The darkness had become profound, and at every step we stumbled on the large stones that cover the paths of those mountains. The situation was painful, but I hoped to find Marshal Ney's troops before long, a hope increased by the bodies we had just encountered of soldiers belonging to his corps. I therefore advanced resolutely, while listening, to charm my tedium, to the stories the Norman told about his country. At last, as dawn began to break, I saw the first houses of a large village. It was Ágreda. I was dismayed not to find any outposts, for that showed not only that none of the marshal's troops occupied the place, but also that his army corps was half a day beyond, since the map indicated no village within 5 or 6 leagues of Ágreda, and it was not possible that regiments had been established in the mountains, far from any habitation. I therefore kept on my guard, and before going farther in, I studied the position. Ágreda, situated in a fairly wide valley, is built at the foot of a high hill, very steep on both sides. The southern slope, which touches the village, is covered with large vineyards, the crest bristles with rocks, and the northern slope is lined with very thick brush, at the foot of which runs a torrent. Beyond, one sees high mountains, uncultivated and uninhabited. Ágreda is crossed, from end to end, by a main street into which open very narrow lanes that the peasants take to go to their vines. Entering the village, I left those lanes and the hills to my right. Fix this position clearly in your mind, for it is important in order to understand my account. Everything slept in Ágreda. It was a favorable moment to cross it. I also had the hope, very faint, it is true, that, on reaching the other end, I might perhaps see the fires of Marshal Ney's advance guard. I went forward, then, after drawing my sabre and ordering the infantryman to ready his musket. The main street was covered with a thick layer of wet leaves, which the inhabitants placed there to turn into manure. Our steps, therefore, made no sound, which pleased me greatly. I walked in the middle of the street, with the soldier on my right, but he, finding himself doubtless too exposed, edged gradually toward the houses, whose walls he hugged, in order to be less visible in case of attack, or closer to one of the lanes that led into the countryside. That proved to me how little I could count on that man. Nevertheless, I made him no remark. Day was beginning to break. We walked the whole length of the main street without meeting anyone. I was already congratulating myself when, on reaching the last houses of the village, I suddenly found myself, at 25 paces, face to face with 4 Spanish Royal Carabineers on horseback, sabres in hand. In any other circumstance, I might have taken those horsemen for French gendarmes, their uniforms being absolutely similar, but gendarmes do not march in the extreme vanguard. Those men could not, therefore, belong to Marshal Ney's corps, and I immediately understood that they were enemies. I therefore at once wheeled about, but at the very moment I completed the turn to face the direction from which I had come, I saw a blade flashing 6 inches from my face. I jerked my head sharply backward, yet I received on my forehead a terrible saber cut, the scar of which I still bear above the left eyebrow. The man who had just wounded me was the Carabineers brigadier who, having left his 4 troopers outside the village, had gone, according to military usage, to reconnoitre whether it contained any enemies. That man, whom I had not run into, probably because he was in some lane while I traversed the main street, had just returned to it to rejoin his men. Seeing me, he had approached silently, on the thick layer of wet leaves. He was about to split my head from behind, when my half-turn, bringing my face toward him, made me receive the blow on my forehead. At that very instant, the 4 Carabineers, who had not moved because they could see what their brigadier was preparing for me, trotted up, and all 5 bore down upon me. I ran, by instinct, toward the houses on my right, in order to put my back to a wall. But, happily, one of those narrow, steep lanes that climbed into the vineyards was just 2 steps away. The infantrymen had already reached it. I leapt into it as well, and the 5 Carabineers followed me there. At least they could not attack me all at once, for there was room for only 1 horse abreast. The brigadier rode in front. The 4 others advanced in single file. Although my position was not as bad as it would have been in the main street, where I would have been surrounded, it remained terrible nonetheless. The abundant blood pouring from my wound had immediately covered my left eye, in which I could no longer see at all, and I felt it spreading to my right eye. I was therefore forced, for fear of being blinded, to keep my head bent toward my left shoulder to make the blood run that way. It was impossible for me to staunch it, being obliged to defend myself against the enemy brigadier, who was delivering great saber cuts at me. I parried them as best I could, all the while backing up the slope, after discarding the scabbard, as well as my bearskin cap, whose weight encumbered me. Not daring to turn my head, so as not to lose sight of my opponent, with whom my blade was crossed, I told the voltigeur, whom I believed to be behind me, to rest his musket on my shoulder, take aim at the Spanish brigadier, and fire. But, seeing no barrel pass, I quickly turned my head, retreating a pace, and what did I see? My wretched Norman soldier fleeing at full speed toward the top of the hill. The Spanish brigadier then redoubled the vigor of his attacks, and seeing that he could not reach me, raised his horse on its hind legs, whose forefeet struck me several times full in the chest. Fortunately, it was not with force, because the ground sloped upward, the horse was unsteady on its hind legs, and each time it came down, I planted a saber cut on its nose, so that the animal soon refused to rear up against me. Then the exasperated brigadier shouted to the trooper behind him, "Take your carbine, the ground is rising, I will bend down, and you will take aim." At this Frenchman over my shoulders, I understood that this order was the signal for my death. But, since to execute it, the trooper had to sheath his saber, unhook his carbine, and since, during that time, the brigadier did not cease thrusting fiercely at me, leaning forward until his chest lay over his mount's neck, I resolved to attempt an act of desperation that would either save me or undo me. Keeping my eye fixed on the Spaniard, and reading in his that he was about to bend over his horse again to reach me, I did not move, but at the very second his upper body lowered toward me, I took a step to the right, and quickly shifting my torso that way as I bent, I dodged my adversary's blow and drove more than half my saber blade into his left flank. The brigadier, uttering a dreadful cry, fell backward onto the croup of his horse. He would probably have rolled to the ground if the trooper behind him had not pushed forward to catch him in his arms. The swift movement I had just made in bending down caused the dispatches I was carrying to the Emperor to slip out of the pocket of my pelisse. I quickly picked them up and immediately climbed to the end of the lane, where the vineyards began. There I turned around and saw the Spanish carabineers bustling around their wounded brigadier and appearing greatly embarrassed by him, as well as by their horses, in that narrow and steep defile. This fight took place in far less time than it takes to tell it. Seeing myself rid of my enemies, at least for the moment, I crossed the vineyards and reached the crest of the hill. Then I considered that it would be impossible for me to fulfill my mission and go join the Emperor at Ágreda. I therefore resolved to return to Marshal Lannes by first making my way back to the spot where I had left Mr. Tassin and his infantry picket. I no longer hoped to find them there, but it was, after all, the direction in which the army I had left the day before lay. I searched in vain for my light infantryman and did not see him, but I saw something more useful for me, a very clear spring. I stopped there for a moment and, tearing a corner from my shirt, made a compress, which I fixed on my wound with my handkerchief. The blood spurting from my forehead had stained the dispatches I held in my hand. I did not trouble myself about that, so preoccupied was I with the unhappy position in which I found myself. The emotions of that agitated night, the march on foot I had made among the stones, with spurred boots, the fight I had just sustained, the pains I felt in my head, the blood I had lost, all that had exhausted my strength. I had taken no food since my departure from Tudela, and could find only water to revive me. I drank in long draughts, and would have rested longer beside that lovely fountain, had I not seen 3 Spanish carabineers, who, riding out of Ágreda, were making toward me along the vineyard paths. Had those men had the good sense to dismount and take off their heavy boots, it is likely they would have overtaken me. But their horses, unable to pass through the vine stalks, climbed with great difficulty along the narrow, stony paths. They could no longer even ascend when, on reaching the upper edge of the vineyards, they were stopped by the huge rocks upon which I had taken refuge. The horsemen, then skirting the base of those blocks of stone, moved parallel to me, at a long carbine's range, shouting for me to surrender, saying that, as soldiers, they would treat me as a prisoner of war, whereas, if the peasants took me, I would inevitably be butchered. This reasoning was not without force. I confess that, had I not been entrusted with dispatches for the Emperor, I might perhaps have surrendered, for I was spent. However, wishing to preserve, as far as possible, the precious trust the Marshal had confided to my courage, I continued to walk on without replying. Whereupon the 3 horsemen, taking their carbines, fired at me. Their bullets struck the rocks at my feet. None hit me, the distance being too great for the aim to be true. I was not disturbed by that, but I was alarmed at the thought that the noise of the shots would attract the peasants, whom the rising sun was, moreover, summoning to their work. I therefore expected to be assailed by the hordes of the fierce inhabitants of those mountains. This sad foreboding seemed to be verified, for I saw, at half a league, some 15 men advancing at the double through the valley, making for me. They carried in their hands something that glittered in the sun. I did not doubt they were peasants armed with their spades, whose iron shone thus. I already considered myself lost, and, in my despair, was about to let myself slide down the rocks on the north side of the hill, so as to descend into the torrent, cross it as best I could, and go hide in some hollow of the great mountains that rise beyond that deep gorge. Then, if I were not discovered, I would set out during the night, making for Tarazona, if I had the strength. This plan presented many chances of ruin, but it was, after all, my last hope. I was about to put it into execution when I noticed that the 3 carabineers ceased firing at me and moved ahead to reconnoiter the group I had taken for peasants. As they approached, the iron tools I had thought were spades or picks were lowered, and I had the inexpressible joy of seeing a platoon volley directed against the Spanish carabineers, who, wheeling about at once, fled rapidly toward Ágreda, though 2 of them seemed to be wounded. "Then they are French," I cried. "Let us go to them." And the happiness of seeing myself delivered gave me back a little strength, so that I went down, leaning on the blade of my sabre. The French had seen me. They climbed the hill, and I found myself in the arms of the brave Lieutenant Tassin. Here are the circumstances that procured me this providential aid. The soldier who had abandoned me while I was engaged with the carabineers in the streets of Ágreda had quickly gained the vineyards, and, bounding like a deer through the stocks, ditches, rocks, and hedges, had covered in very little time the 2 leagues that separated him from the point where we had left Mr. Tassin's post. The detachment was about to set out for Tarazona, and was eating soup when my Norman light infantryman, arriving quite out of breath, but unwilling to miss a bite, sat down beside a pot and began to breakfast very calmly, without saying a word about what had just taken place at Ágreda. Fortunately, he was seen by Mr. Tassin, who, astonished to see him back, asked where he had left the officer he had been charged to escort. "Faith," replied the Norman, "I left him in the large village, his head half split open and fighting with Spanish horsemen who were giving him great sabre blows." At these words, Lieutenant Tassin had his detachment take up arms, chose the 15 nimblest men, and set off at the double for Ágreda. That officer and his little troop had already gone a league when, hearing shots, they concluded that I was still alive, but in need of very prompt help. Spurred by the hope of saving me, those brave fellows redoubled their pace, and at last caught sight of me on the hill crest, serving as a target for the bullets of 3 Spanish horsemen. Mr. Tassin and his men were worn out. I myself could go no farther. So we made a short halt, during which, you may well believe, I expressed my lively gratitude to the lieutenant and to his light infantrymen, whose joy nearly equalled mine. We regained the bivouac, where Mr. Tassin had left half his men. The company's cantinière was there. Her mule carried 2 skins of wine, bread, and ham. I bought them to give to the light infantrymen, and we made a breakfast of which I had great need, and in which the 2 hussars left at that post the preceding night took part. One of them, riding the monk's mule, lent me a horse, and we set out for Tarazona. I suffered horribly, because the dried blood formed a crust upon my wound. On arriving at Tarazona, I found Marshal Lannes's advance guard. The general commanding it had my wound dressed, then gave me a horse and 2 hussars to escort me as far as Tudela, where I arrived in the middle of the night. The marshal, though ill, received me at once and seemed deeply moved by my misadventure. However, the battle bulletin of Tudela had to be promptly transmitted to the emperor, who must have been impatiently awaiting news of the army corps of the Ebro. I would have all the more wished to carry it to him, as the marshal, enlightened by what had just happened to me in the mountains of Soria, consented that the officer charged to go to Napoleon should pass by way of Miranda and Burgos, whose roads, covered with French troops, presented no danger. But I was so unwell and so worn out that it would have been physically impossible for me to gallop post at full speed. The marshal therefore entrusted this mission to Commander Gehenuk, his brother-in-law. I handed him the dispatches. They were reddened with my blood. Commander Saint-Mars, in charge of the secretariat, wished to copy them and change the envelope. "No, no," cried the marshal. "It is well that the emperor see how valiantly Captain Marbot defended them." He therefore sent the packet as it was, adding a note to explain to His Majesty the cause of the delay, to praise me, and to request a reward for Lieutenant Tassin and the men who had hastened with such zeal to my aid, without counting the dangers to which they might have been exposed had the enemy been numerous. In fact, some time afterward, the Emperor granted the cross to Mr. Tassin and to his sergeant, and a gratuity of 100 francs to each of the light infantrymen who had accompanied them. As for the Norman soldier, brought before a court-martial for having abandoned his post before the enemy, he was sentenced to drag the ball for 2 years and to finish his term of service in a pioneer's company. That concludes the 7th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.